Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is Gainward's GTX 560 Ti 448 limited edition graphics card. I think it looks great. Actually, it's almost identical to their GTX 570 golden sample, and you might be surprised to know that the similarities go beyond aesthetics. Today's story starts in January of 2011. Nvidia had just launched their excellent mid-range 560 Ti. Now the 560 Ti was based on the GF114 GPU. It featured 384 cores and had 1GB of GDDR5 VRAM. It was a solid performer for the price and admittedly my dream card, though unattainable as I was on a budget of about 50 quid. Fast forward 10 months and the 560 Ti 448 made its first appearance. It was in limited supply and exclusive to a handful of third-party vendors, including Gainward here. Now, unlike the original GF114 based original, the 448 edition has under its hood the GF110 GPU found in the higher end 500 series cards. The 560 Ti 448 wasn't some unlocked or enhanced re-release of the original 560 Ti, it was actually a slightly cut down version of the faster 570, and as such sat right between the two in terms of price and performance. This meant that at the time, the 560 Ti 448 performed about 15% faster than the older 560 Ti, and while some reviewers said that you might as well get this instead of the 570, others felt that stretching your budget just a little bit more was still worth it. Today I've paired it with my modern system to see what it can do with a range of games of all ages, starting with older releases that this thing would have tackled with ease early last decade, and then working our way up to modern and more challenging games. Let's start back in 2011 with the legendary Battlefield 3. I love this game and it still holds a special place in my heart. Now back in 2011 I probably played it at about 30 FPS and at 720p resolution if I was lucky, but then again I had a far weaker setup. I still managed to have fun, but it's always nice to go back and revisit personal favourites with more powerful hardware. Speaking of which, I am using the 560 Ti 448 in combination with an i5-12400F and 16 gigs of 3200MHz dual channel DDR4. Nothing high end, but this pairing is more powerful than anything on the market back then. That said, the important thing here is getting the absolute most out of the card, and that is certainly not a problem today. This is more of a celebration of this old card as opposed to a realistic showcase of a build you should put together. Battlefield 3 runs like a dream at over 60 FPS. This is at medium, but it's surprising how good it still looks. Even the percentile lows hovered around 60 FPS, so no issues with stuttering or frame drops here. 2012's Far Cry 3 Next at 1080p medium once again. I also enabled SSAO. Now back in 2012, within the first year of the card's launch, there wouldn't be many games that would have given it issues. This was a mid-range DX11 GPU with 1.28 gigs of GDDR5. Now these days that amount sounds very little, but 10-11 years ago you'd probably find that your games didn't even use that much, especially if you were being a little more careful with your chosen settings in an attempt to hit higher frame rates. Far Cry 3 at medium is a good example of that. The game still looks good today and it plays nicely on this card. Perhaps one of the most demanding and graphically impressive games of 2013 was Crysis 3. Even at low this looks good, and I remember thinking the same all those years ago. This is the sort of game that eats 1GB cards for breakfast, so the extra 280MB certainly helps a little, but I wouldn't have been surprised if anyone using one of these back in the day dropped the resolution a little to try and alleviate some of the in-game stutter that plagues the busier areas filled with dense foliage. We got a 60 FPS plus average though, still with the 560 Ti 448. Now in 2014 we saw the launch of Watch Dogs. I remember buying this with a PlayStation 4 as part of a launch bundle because my old PC could not run it smoothly at all. I think I had an FX 6300 at the time. All I know is that it stuttered like crazy, so I was grateful for the consistent 30 FPS that my PlayStation could deliver. After upgrading a few years down the line, I downloaded this game again for PC because it was one of my favourites. I used to spend ages just driving around doing nothing. Now doing that in 2023 with a 560 Ti 448 will net you about 52 FPS at medium with FXAA, a nice balance between visuals and performance. In 2015 we saw a few major releases on PC, not least of all being GTA 5. This had already been on 7th generation consoles for a while, so looking back, and it's no surprise that it runs really well on mid-range cards. The 560 Ti 448 is no exception, hitting over 60 FPS on average with the high settings, bar the texture quality which is set to normal. This is where the amount of VRAM, although increased over the original card, limits us to normal textures. Sure, we could still set the texture quality to high, but this will incur a few more dips and drops. At the other end of the performance spectrum we have The Witcher 3. This received a next-gen patch this year, but I downgraded it to the classic version for the sake of this video. At 1080p low settings are best, but these quality options could be increased by dropping the resolution if you have a higher FPS target in mind. I'd say it would have been around 2015 that the VRAM limit would have become more noticeable for 560 Ti 448 owners. Not necessarily problematic, but noticeable, and not every game released that year would have utilised all the memory, of course. In 2016, Skyrim got a re-release under the Special Edition title. This improved the visuals for PC and next-gen at the time consoles, and it was a very welcome upgrade in my opinion. This is capped at 60 FPS by default, and 560 Ti 448 owners wouldn't have had much to worry about, I'm sure, especially if they managed their expectations. Hitting the frame rate cap was possible at low settings with ease, and I've also enabled TAA here to smooth out those horrible jagged edges. Even with the visual upgrades, this was never the most demanding game in the world, so it's no surprise that it runs well. We're still coming awfully close to that VRAM limit once again though. Fortnite is by no means the same game that it was in 2017 in terms of visuals or performance, but it still runs at full 1080p with 100% resolution scale. There are a few issues with frame times here. At this point, the 560 Ti 448 would continue to see driver support for another year until Nvidia ended it in March of 2018. The end of driver support, however, doesn't mean that a card suddenly becomes obsolete or useless. 2018's Kingdom Come Deliverance was launched about a month before Nvidia pulled the plug on this card, but even today it still runs okay at 900p with the low settings. At this point in time, the VRAM limitation and the power of the card itself were both more noticeable factors in its waning performance. It was a bit much to hope for 60 FPS here, but achieving at least 30 is still doable, and this, what is one of my favourite games of all time, still looks really nice. Now I think 2019 would have been the year that those who still own 560 Ti 448s may have finally decided to upgrade, especially with the likes of Rockstar's open world Epic finally making its way to PC. Firing up Red Dead Redemption 2 on one of these cards may have been quite disappointing, especially as the lowest settings wouldn't have even allowed for 20 FPS. Not only were the drivers at least a year out of date by now, but 1.28 gigs of VRAM just wouldn't have cut it, and even if it did, the power of the card itself wouldn't have been enough to hit 30 FPS at any setting or resolution. Now it wasn't all bad news in 2019 because fast-paced online multiplayer shooters like Apex Legends here could still be made to play at a somewhat competitive frame rate by enabling dynamic res scale to target 60 FPS. 720p was still the limit as a base resolution here. There would have been other games that ran fine of course, and some that ran worse than even Red Dead, but by now the lack of driver support, tiny amount of VRAM, as well as the lack of modern API support would have been rather limiting. There will still be some games that launch and play on this card today, but anything that requires DX12 won't start on the 560 Ti 448, at least from what I've found. So things like Elden Ring, Forza Horizon 5 and Spider-Man are out of the question. But then again, they wouldn't perform well anyway. Not a bad run for the 560 Ti 448 all in all. If you bought this upper mid-range card at launch, back in the day for its sub $300 price, you would have gotten maybe 5-6 good years out of it, especially if dropping resolutions and visual quality settings were compromises you were willing to make. Thus ends our retrospective of this limited edition card, and I hope you've enjoyed watching. If you did, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.